Well, as you saw earlier over the weekend, the terrible story of Neo Mahlangu emerged, showing that the 16-year-old boy had been killed by his aunt after his body was exhumed from a house in Tsakane. But in a country where what we call gender-based violence is such a huge issue, how do we discuss this kind of violence? What words do we use? When is gender important in discussing violence and when is it not? Professor Thabo Ditsele is an associate professor of sociolinguistics at the Tsakane University of Technology. Professor Ditsele, good afternoon to you. Normally, when I think of the phrase gender-based violence, in my head, I'm thinking of a man attacking a woman using physical violence against a woman. And part of that is because she is a woman and he is a man. Is that the right way to think about that phrase?
Oh, well, Stephen, one can appreciate the fact that in our society, if one look at the number of cases reported of males abusing females, by far they outweigh the number of cases of women abusing men. So for that reason, if our emphasis is on male or men abusing women, gender is not the right term to use. I would propose that in that context, then we should call it female-based violence, because almost every case that is reported, or we take it for granted, it's a foregone conclusion that each time when you hear gender-based violence, you know that the suspected perpetrator is a man. You know that the person on the receiving end is a woman. So I have a problem with how gender is used in this context. If it only means one gender at the receiving end, then it's a misnomer. It should not be the term used. We should say female-based violence, because in South Africa when we talk GBV, we talk female-based.
I mean, I suppose an argument, and I mean, I think it's important to be really precise about the words that we use, and at the same time, we must also know that, I mean, you and I are having this conversation in English. English changes, but English words are sometimes translated differently to people who speak and think in other languages, which is the majority of the country, it's most people. So it gets quite complicated. I mean, is there maybe a limit to how precise we can be? I mean, I could argue that we could call it male-based violence because it's men, it's people like you and I who commit the violence.
That's correct, Stephen. I mean, 90% of South Africa's population, doesn't speak English as a home language. So one can understand that, when you use gender-based violence in this context, it becomes a foregone conclusion that can only mean men, abusing women. But as from a point of view of a linguist, I go deeper than just leaving it at, face value, that a majority of people do not speak English as a home language, to conscientize or to raise questions that show that, yes, a majority may not be home language speakers of English, but these are the implications of, choice of words that are used. I mean, I have a responsibility as a linguist, to step up to the plate to say, have you really interrogated a word like, a word like gender? When I teach my students, I always speak about, where the line is, between what is gender, what is sex. I know that in our society, we use them interchangeably, but they are actually not used, they are not synonyms, right? We know that sex has to do with, how one was born. If I can use human anatomy, someone who is born male would have male genitalia, someone who's born female would have female genitalia. But when it comes to gender, it's about how we choose to live. So that you and I were born male, but we've chosen to live as male. So the word man applies to us because it's a choice. It doesn't apply to all males who choose. I mean, some of the males, let me say, have chosen not to become male.
And it takes us to another conversation around the binary nature of all of this, but perhaps we should continue that conversation. It's a very important conversation at a different point. I do want to just concentrate on this violence. There's another thing that comes up, Professor, which is that we use the word fight. So you'll hear the phrase, the fight against gender-based violence. Governments or societies fight, how we must all fight against gender-based violence. But is fight the right word? Because fight, there's actually violence all on its own. And yet, maybe it's appropriate because it's such a strong word.
Yes, fight is a very strong word. But again, we have to look at, figurative meaning of words as opposed to literal meaning of words, no matter how strong words are. So in the context of fight against poverty, fight against unemployment, fight against crime, the necessity of using that word is to show that this is really a problem in society. Right, so anybody who has a brain cells would know that we don't mean it in a literal sense of picking up arms and fighting people. So and I trust that the society that we are, people who understand that the choice to use strong language in this context is because this is such a problem to our society.
I mean, it also gets to how the meaning of words changes over time. So, I mean, I think maybe 50 years ago, the word fight probably had the meaning of a physical fight. But now, as you say, when we talk about fighting unemployment, for example, it means something else. But it also means that over time, in a way, the phrase gender-based violence has come to mean a specific thing as well. And I mean, this goes to another question, which is the power of words. I work in words all the time. I sort of know they have a huge power. Could we overemphasize the power they have?
Well, like I said, it goes back to context, right? It goes back to context. A person like me would be looking at how, meaning might get lost. How over time, like you are right, a term that meant something 50 years ago, the meaning may have shifted, right? So my suspicion is if we stick to GBV as an example, as our theme, there is a chance that 30 years from now, gender-based violence would have been so entrenched in society that it can only mean if the alleged perpetrator is a man and the victim is a woman. Whether that is right or wrong is neither here nor there. The point for me is what then happens to, let's say, violence meted against male persons. Are we going to then look for a new concept so that when we use that concept, it then fits, that everybody's society is clear that this time we are talking about males or men being on the receiving end? Maybe we've headed in that direction. I do not know. But as of now, all evidence points to the direction that GBV is now establishing itself as one-directional, male being perpetrator, female being victim.
I almost wonder if the actual problem is not the term but the word violence, that maybe we need, I can't imagine what it would be, maybe we need another word to denote this particular type of violence, that, a word that means an attack by a man against a woman.
Well, it might happen in future that someone can coin something. I mean, even this GBV was coined by someone. So it's up to society to then say, okay, fine. I mean, remember there's a new phenomenon called femicide. It hasn't always been there. So someone coined it, gave it context, gave it meaning, and today, because it's now settled as a term, if we talk femicide, we know that femicide can only mean a female victim. So at this rate, I'm convinced that there will come a point where someone would come up with a term that will fit the purpose. What normally doesn't happen in terminology development is that people don't coin terms deliberately. Someone would, out of nowhere, come up with a term, throws it on the wall. If it sticks, that's what society will use.
It'll be on Twitter already, I'm sure. Professor Thabo Ditsele.
I hope so.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor of Sociolinguistics, what a field.